Hello, and welcome to Charted, an astrology podcast. My name's James, and today we're going to talk about the inner planets. So, I had originally stated in the last episode that this episode would be about Mercury, but as I began recording the episode and my kind of first attempt at it, I realized it might actually be better to talk about the inner planets as a group briefly, because they have some things in common as well as certain attributes that they kind of operate under that are different from the outer planets. And I think I can kind of make things easier, don't have to repeat myself, or maybe from an organizational perspective, people wouldn't have to, I wouldn't have to have people refer back to the Mercury episode when you're listening to the Venus episode, for example, or things like that. So I think talking about the kind of groupings of the planet is something I wanted to do. So we're going to talk about the inner planets kind of broadly, what sets them apart, what makes them distinct from the outer planets, also distinct from the sun and the moon, the luminaries. So yeah, this is what we're going to talk about today. And then the next episode, we'll actually dive into Mercury. So if you've been waiting for that, sorry. But here we go. So, inner planets. Why are they unique, or what's different about them? So the very first and very obvious thing, and this just has a bunch of implications, is that the orbits of the inner planets, that is Mercury and Venus, are between the orbit of the Earth and the Sun. Right? It seems obvious. But what that means is that from our perspective on Earth, because we can see, right, when we watch the sun through the zodiac, right, what are we watching? We're not watching the sun moving necessarily. We're just watching our perspective shift as the Earth orbits the sun, right? But it appears as if the sun is orbiting around the zodiac. It's moving around the zodiac. Right? It's just a perspective thing. It's not the actual reality. It's simply a perspective. So our perspective on Earth is that the sun is moving around the zodiac throughout the year. Because Venus and Mercury have orbits that are inside of the Earth orbit, that means we can see their full orbits play out as the sun moves around the zodiac. What does that mean? It means that Mercury and Venus are going to stay close to the sun. We're going to watch their full orbit. We'll watch them move past the sun, and then as they kind of get to a point in their orbit that looks, it's a perspective thing, looks kind of like it stops or is staying still, and then they'll kind of move backwards, back across the sun. Again, they'll kind of get to that point where they slow down, stop, and change direction, and then they'll move forward and kind of move back across the sun again. It would be kind of like if you were standing in, say, an empty parking lot and you were watching a car drive in circles. Because you're not above the car, you can't see the actual loop that it's making. What you would be seeing is the car driving to the right, and then it kind of, as it's turning, it's making that corner on the loop. It kind of doesn't really move anywhere, right, from a straight line perspective. As you're looking at it, it kind of looks like it's just driving in the same spot, but then it drives back to the left, gets to the other side of the circle, same thing, right? Or if you're watching runners on a track, pick anything, it's that same idea. It's just a perspective thing. It's a kind of a misjudgment of the right depth of something. You're only seeing the x coordinate on a graph is the way you would think about it. You're not seeing the y coordinate because you're in a kind of one-dimensional, two-dimensional perspective. So you only see that x component. This is something that, from an audio perspective, an audio format, is not very easy to visualize. I will put something in the show notes to help people visualize this a little better. But basically what we see with the inner planets is that they stay close to the sun. That's kind of the gist of where I'm going. So all of their retrogrades always happen around the sun, and that means they are never all that far from it. Mercury is never going to be more than 28 degrees from the sun. which means Mercury is never more than one sign away from the sun at most, which also means that if you know somebody's sun sign, you have about a 1 in 3 chance of guessing their Mercury sign. Venus is never more than, I think it's about 44, 45 degrees. I don't remember the exact number off the top of my head, but it's about that, which means it's never more than 2 signs away from the sun. So again, if you're going to guess, you know somebody's sun sign, you got about a 1 in 5 chance of guessing it because of how close they stay. And so what that means is that each sun sign is going to have a much tighter set of its Mercury and Venus combinations, right? Because every other placement, you've got effectively 1 in 12 chance for each planet, right? Except maybe the generational planets, because those are so slow moving. So it kind of adds an interesting element to things, because it means, for example, if you're an Aries sun, all Aries suns are going to have either a Pisces Mercury, an Aries Mercury, or a Taurus Mercury. So you kind of get 3 flavors of that sun. And then obviously you can throw the Venus in there, and that adds an extra dimension, right? And so the number of combinations you have is much more limited compared to other placements, like Mars, for example. Mars, it could be in any of the 12 signs relative to somebody's sun sign. So it's a lot more variation. Another thing, because they stay close to the sun, and because the zodiac, as we view it, is looking at things above the horizon, that means Mercury and Venus spend a lot of time invisible because they're in the sky during the day. And it also means that they are pretty much only visible right after sunset or right before sunrise, depending on where they're at in their retrograde cycles. So if the sun is at, say, 15 degrees of, let's just pick any sign, Aries, and Mercury is at, say, 0 degrees of Aries, that means it's a evening star, right? It's behind the sun. So that means the sun is going to set first. So Mercury will still be in the sky, or Venus will still be in the sky after the sun has set, for that tiny little bit of time before Mercury also sets, or Venus also sets. Conversely, if the sun was at, say, 15 degrees and you had Mercury, Venus at 0 degrees of Taurus, right? The next sign up, 15 degrees away, they would be morning stars. So if they're ahead of the sun, they're morning stars, which means you will see them right before the sunrise. And again, Venus has a bit further range, so it's out in the sky, it's visible a little bit longer. But again, it goes back to this idea that there's a sense of invisibility with these signs because they stay so close to the sun. A good chunk of their time is spent invisible, which means they're going to deal with qualities that are slightly less visible, slightly less tangible than the other planets. We'll really see this with Mercury. Venus, it's a little more ambiguous. Now, their retrograde cycles are also going to be different from the outer planets. They're both going to have a pretty cyclical, pretty consistent retrograde cycle. Venus has the most rigidly consistent cycle of any planet. It retrogrades 5 times every 8 years, and it does it at the exact same degrees, -1. So, for example, we had a Venus retrograde earlier this year, right back in, I believe it was March. It was about 10-ish degrees of Aries. I might be mixing up the Mercury retrograde because they were both retrograded this year at about the same spot. But it was about 10 degrees, let's just say 10 degrees of Aries. So that means in 8 years' time, Venus will retrograde at 9 degrees of Aries. Right? Same exact spot, pretty similar time of year. And then throughout the rest of its cycle, the other points that it retrogrades are also going to have that same thing going on, where they retrograde same exact sign, same exact place, just -1 degree every 8 years. So it slowly shifts through the zodiac, and those points make a star, a 5-pointed star, which is pretty interesting. It's very much a separate conversation for a different day. It's not something I've researched a ton, but there's plenty of astrologers out there who have done a tremendous amount of work looking into it, researching it. It's a pretty fascinating subject. So if you're curious, by all means, I recommend Googling it or searching it, whatever you want to do. Find people who've researched it. It's very interesting. It can be quite useful for finding certain patterns. Now, the retrograde cycle for Mercury is a little less consistent than Venus. It happens about 3 times a year. I don't know the pattern off the top of my head, but I believe it's just it's just kind of like every, couple months, like 3 months or so, 4 months, something like that. But Mercury retrogrades for about 3 weeks at a time. And it's pretty consistent. It happens a lot because Mercury is so close to the sun. It's going to happen frequently. Mercury's orbit is very fast. Again, because of its proximity, but also because Mercury as a planet moves fairly quickly. So they both have retrogrades that are pretty well scheduled, right? They're fairly regular. And again, the way they move is their retrograde cycles will always feature conjunctions with the sun. The retrograde cycles for the outer planets will always feature oppositions to the sun. So that is one of the major distinctions between the inner planets and outer planets. Because they have these conjunctions, what will happen is, let's say a planet, let's start with the conjunction, right? A planet is conjunct the sun, it's moving direct. Direct means it's moving forward in the zodiac. It's going to be moving quickly from our perspective. It's not like the planet's orbit changes at all. Right? In space, it's always moving at the same speed, but our perspective on Earth, it's changing speeds, right? Because again, it goes back to, we're watching it make a circle, but from kind of a 2D perspective, right? So we can't see the full depth of the circle, so we just see the kind of the back and forth movement. So starting with the conjunction, planet will be moving fast. The inner planet will be moving fast. It'll kind of move out to its furthest extent or get close to it, and it will slow down and eventually come to a stop or the appearance of a standstill, and then it will move retrograde. Retrograde just means it's moving backwards in the zodiac. Again, the planet doesn't actually move backwards. It's just a perspective thing. And it will retrograde backwards until it conjuncts the sun again, but while it's retrograde, and then it'll move backwards continuing until it hits its furthest extent, where it then slows down, stops, and changes direction. It slows down before the furthest extent, obviously, but that process, we'll see it move back to its furthest extent where it will change direction, move direct, and then repeat the process. And so that's how the retrograde cycles work for the inner planets. You have 2 conjunctions, effectively, that happen, which, as I said, is different from the outer planets because they make oppositions with the sun during their retrogrades. So the inner planets make conjunctions, which means they're going to be, again, tied deeply to the sun. They're going to make appearances. They're going to have connections to the sun frequently in their cycles, as well as because they are between the Earth and the sun, or really more specifically, the moon and the sun, right? Because Earth is where we have our perspective point, but the moon is the closest planet to us, if you will. So the moon, as we discussed in the last 2 episodes, the moon represents our mind, our body, right? It's kind of the physical projection of our consciousness, the physical reflection of our consciousness that's produced by what? The sun, right? So you have the kind of the spiritual being the sun and the physical being the moon. And you have these 2 lights of who we are, the physical reality and the spiritual reality. But you have 2 planets in between them, that is Mercury and Venus. And so Mercury and Venus in many ways represent things that kind of deal with this intermediary between the spiritual, the conscious self, and the physical self, the mind, the subconscious self. And so a lot of their significations are going to play off of those dynamics, and how they operate is also going to play off a lot of those dynamics, with Mercury kind of being much more the true, just kind of in between, kind of middle, foot in both worlds, whereas Venus tends to be a bit more dealing with the physical reality. But even then still has concepts that really tie into what the sun represents. So both planets, because of their proximity to the sun, are going to deal with solar influence a lot. And they're also going to make conjunctions with the sun a lot. And they're going to have characteristics that deal with the sun a lot. In addition, they have retrograde cycles. Again, retrograde, it's going to be something we'll do a full episode on, but for the brief kind of explanation, the retrograde cycle of any planet is kind of a look-back period. It's a period of, right, it's turned backwards. The perspective has changed direction, so it's looking back. It's reassessing or redoing or rethinking what has already been covered, right? It's like if you're traveling and suddenly you had to make a cutback, and you can kind of see everything you did before, right? All the land you've traveled before, you're kind of going back over it, right? Reassessing, hey, I understand the best way to get across this terrain now because I'm going back in reverse. I can see the way we did it the first time. Maybe it wasn't so great. Let's do it a different way. Or let's try a different path, right? That's kind of what the retrograde represents, is this kind of looking back. And each planet, obviously, you deal with its own significations, what it's about, and how that retrograde kind of fully plays out. But it's a period where things are not really moving forward the way you want it to. It's kind of we gotta reestablish things before we can kind of move forward again. And so for the inner planets, their retrogrades always feature kind of distinct connections to our consciousness, to our solar identity, because they move over that solar point twice during their whole full cycle. And supposedly, or not supposedly, but in theory, if you start at the conjunction, it's effectively 3 times. So that's kind of the inner planets. That's the main dynamics. Again, they're kind of this intermediary force or representations kind of between the consciousness and the reality of ourselves. They act as kind of the go-between, and they deal with a lot of very kind of personal topics in relation to things that stem from our being. Again, they have the frequency of their retrogrades means that there's a lot of kind of reassessing things, right? They're fairly active. And then the other thing is, because they are tied to the sun, they're going to move around the zodiac in about a year, right? The sun takes a year to move through the zodiac. That also means the inner planets, by extension, always have about a yearly cycle, effectively. So you can count on their things to kind of cycle in a year's time, more or less. Obviously, you got to deal with the retrograde cycles and things like that, but you can count on them to not really have the long-lasting cyclical implications that some of the outer planets have, is really what I'm getting at with that. So that's the inner planets. That's kind of the main gist of why we make them distinct. It really just ties into, from a perspective I cannot talk. From a perspective situation, they're tied to the sun. That's really a lot of the main of where I'm getting with this episode. So that's it for now. Next episode, we'll dive into Mercury proper, really go through it and get a sense for what Mercury represents. And then obviously we'll move to Venus and then to the outer planets. So thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed.